Nigel, there's been a lot of focus in recent months on the role of the finance sector in addressing biodiversity, putting a high enough price on natural capital. There's been the UK government's disruptive review on the economics of biodiversity. And a lot of companies are also talking about using nature-based solutions, carbon offsetting on the road to net zero. But one thing that seems to be overlooked amid all the net zero target setting, and I don't know if this was intentional or not, is the fact that previous targets set out by consumer goods companies to end deforestation in their own supply chains by 2020 were spectacularly missed. And you and I have discussed this. Well, I think we've been discussing this for about 5 years since I first met you. But I mean, even in the palm oil supply chain, where there has been actually most progress on deforestation, this time last year, CDP was reporting that just under 20% of companies are on track to meet their targets to end deforestation. So Rainforest Alliance was a signatory to the 2014 New York Declaration on Forests, in which governments, NGOs signed up along with companies to have natural forest loss by 2020 and end it by 2030. But according to its progress report last year, deforestation actually increased compared to 2014. So, you know, what went wrong, and what's your view on can we course correct?
Well, we have to course correct. There's not another option, yeah, because otherwise there won't be much forest left. There'll be continued massive loss of biodiversity, and we know that deforestation is a big part of the greenhouse gas emission story as well. And you're absolutely right that this has been a colossal failure. In 2014, hundreds of companies, some of the world's most prominent and well-known major brands of consumer goods companies, trading companies, and others, made very high-profile commitments in New York, here in New York, with the Secretary General of the UN. I was there in the room. It was extraordinary to see these CEOs lined up saying by 2020, we'll be eliminating deforestation from our supply chains. So that was 6 years before the target date. And I think what we saw was a lamentable lack of progress towards that goal. A tiny handful of companies, I would say, of large companies, if we're taking the sort of the bigger players on this, got serious about it, did some very thorough analysis, really got to grips with their supply chains and understanding where the problem was, and made good progress, although even they struggled to eliminate deforestation completely. But they're well on the way. But they're in a small minority. And some of the biggest players absolutely made very little progress. And some of them are even now talking about, well, maybe 2030 is when we should be looking at as a more realistic target. At the same time, I would say, as their communications teams and consultants are working hard to get people to focus on other issues and draw attention away from that. Now, that said, I think those companies are working to address the issue. It's taking them a lot longer than they thought. It's more complicated than they thought. And I think for many of them, the honest truth is that it's more expensive than they thought. There are real short-term costs in not sourcing certain commodities from certain places where they know deforestation is taking place. And so some tough choices that have to be made at the top of those companies about whether they're willing to incur those costs. So that's what's happened. Now, what we're seeing is civil society, environmental groups, campaigning organizations especially have come together. They're working hard to push again on targets that are much closer than, say, 2025 or 2030. Some companies are saying by 2022, 2023 we'll be there. So there's some progress there, but fundamentally there seems to be a lack of accountability in this space, that a CEO can stand up and make those kinds of statements, get all that positive press coverage, and then really not suffer very serious consequences for not meeting the goals.
Do you think that the science-based targets, which never really has accounted for offsetting, that's not that was only set up really to look at companies' own supply chains and then only really energy, not deforestation. And I know the Science Based Targets Network is developing a standard, and that will be later this year, I think, to try, which is going to incorporate carbon offsets. But presumably it will also incorporate a bit more metrics on what companies are doing in their own supply chains on deforestation. Are you?
Well, it has to. I mean, we see analysis from some of the larger companies that the vast majority of their emissions are in their supply chains, right? So you think of factories and smokestacks and trucks distributing their products and so on here, but 70, 80% of their emissions are actually where the products are being produced, maybe several steps removed from the company itself, back down those supply chains, the farmers, the deforestation, the land use in those supply chains, the chemical fertilizers that are used, the nitrogen fertilizers, for example, emit enormous amounts of greenhouse gases. So all of that has to be addressed. And I think the key thing is that while offsetting is an important part of the transition process to getting emissions down to much lower levels than they are now, companies first and foremost need to take responsibility for what's happening in their own houses, in their own supply chains, at home, if you like. They've got to address that first, and really push that. And there are going to be significant costs to doing that. Those costs need to be absorbed, passed on to the consumers to some extent. Government regulation needs to support this, or ideally actually demand it. Regulation is really the powerful lever to achieve much more rapid progress on this. We'll start to see, I think, much stronger leadership from the US on that now. We have seen in Europe already. Hopefully that's going to ratchet up. And then the companies, of course, will move much more quickly to implement their own changes and their own voluntary steps to try to reduce the threat of regulation as well.
Well, the UK has recently talked about regulating deforestation in supply chains of companies. I mean, is that? I'm not sure where that is. They haven't actually done it yet. They're consulting on it, are they?
And so is the European Union. The European Commission is working on this, and there is also draft legislation here in the US Congress that some members of Congress have been developing. We've been consulted on that, and I think it's very important. I mean, we've seen some parallels with modern day slavery, right, where the UK, US, and others now have laws which mean that you're in big trouble if you're caught with slavery in your supply chain. And slavery is rife in some of these supply chains. If you take products like cocoa, where you've got very low cost labor issues and so on, some of the plantation sectors and so on, there are constant accusations and evidence from places like Brazil, West Africa of slavery, even child slavery in those supply chains. So we've seen some good moves by governments on that. And I think we will see some strong moves on deforestation as well, because of the imperative to address the looming biodiversity extinction crisis and climate change. These are big issues. They're high in the media, and I think we're going to see politicians taking a lot more action on these things directly, and the companies will be forced to act.
And what about companies just acting on their own? I mean, the big complaint from companies was that all these NGOs are telling us we have to end deforestation in our supply chains, but they all have different definitions of what deforestation is. It's not very clear to us. We need some kind of real guidance. And you came up with, Rainforest Alliance was a member of, that came up with the accountability framework. How successful has that been? Has that driven change, or you know?
Yes, we together with others convened a group of leading global environmental and human rights groups to come up with a framework that would give companies much clearer definitions of what deforestation and some human rights abuses look like, what best practices would be, and encourage them to voluntarily adopt this framework. That was launched and is being adopted. We are seeing major companies, some of the largest trading companies and consumer goods companies are referencing the framework. They're adjusting their policies to incorporate the language in the framework. And if you like, the excuse of that confusion and lack of definition and lack of clarity, we aimed to address that, and I think we did. And the companies have said that they appreciated that very much. They found the guidance helpful. It's very practical. We didn't take an extreme position on these things. We worked to come up with very practical guidance that we felt the companies could realistically implement over time. So that's now being heavily promoted as a big effort on the communications and engagement side of that now. We've received additional funding for several more years from various of the governments that have been supporting that work that we've been doing, and we expect it to continue. So good engagement and good momentum there. The ball is very much in the court of the companies, though. Right now, they have to really do the hard work to implement that, and that requires a very strong sense of traceability, where their products are actually coming from. What is the risk of deforestation in those locations? Why is it occurring? How can they engage with those suppliers, which may be even 2 or 3 steps removed from them directly? How do they engage with them to address that? At what point do they disengage, right? We would encourage them to be in dialogue with those suppliers to help them improve, encourage them to improve, incentivize them potentially with higher prices or commitments to buy over the long term from those suppliers, and work consistently to address those issues. At some point, though, disengaging if there isn't progress, and working to establish supplies elsewhere. One of the fundamental changes that may help for many of these companies is establishing basically much closer relationships with the farmers at the end of these supply chains, and working with them to help them improve their practices. Right? Historically, this commodities industry has done the opposite. A sack of soy from here is the same as a sack of soy from there. Well, that's not the case if it was produced with deforestation and slave labor here, and it was produced sustainably there. It's a very different product, even if it looks and tastes exactly the same. And so that's the challenge to the industry, to unpack that and ensure that their supplies are clean. And once they've done that, and once they've worked to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and so on in those supply chains, then it's appropriate to look, I think, at offsetting some of the other emissions, which, for example, from air travel and so on, which it's impossible to eliminate completely.
How much is technology? I mean, we just keep seeing all kinds of technology, not only in the surveillance, like global forest watch type surveillance, but even on the ground. I was looking at something that Rainforest Connections has done, where they've got mobile phones that are listening in the forest to hear. I mean, how much of the heavy lift on this do you think is going to be down to increased surveillance?
The technology is really helpful in this regard. So you've got much better access to information derived from high-resolution satellite imagery through partnerships like Global Forest Watch and other groups as well, that basically for free give companies extraordinary information at high resolution, constantly updated about what's happening around the world. And Global Forest Watch has been collaborating with some of the big companies as well on the uptake and use of that, and learning how to make it more and more useful to them. Then you've got sort of the sensors on the ground, right? So this proliferation of low-cost sensors, acoustic sensors and camera traps and so on, which allow us to start to observe the biodiversity and monitor the biodiversity. You can't see that so easily from a satellite. But you can start to monitor that in sensitive landscapes, high priority areas, and connect that up in extraordinary ways to build dashboards showing how these landscapes are doing. There are some new organizations like Natural State, which are doing phenomenal work in that area, I think, and are seeing significant demand for that. Artificial intelligence comes in there as well to process the data that's produced and give you basically real-time, high-quality information about what's going on. Then you've got the social side and the development side of the story, right? So that's also can be quite hard to monitor, but the workers, the farmers, even the children across these landscapes have increasingly access to mobile technology, and at least simple low-cost phones that will send and receive text messages are now ubiquitous, and smartphones more and more, even in some of the poorer landscapes where we work. And so those give an opportunity also to gather and share information anonymously with workers about potential abuses. And there are some nonprofits and service providers who are specializing in enabling that. So there shouldn't be much of an excuse from the companies to say, well, we don't really know what's going on, or nobody told us, or we, right? And of course they need to take a risk-based approach. So substantial portions of where they're sourcing from, there's very low risk. Where there's higher risk or very high risk, then they need to invest in the partnerships and the technology and developing the know-how within the company itself to ensure that they're monitoring the situation effectively. And the technology now enables them to do that.
So do you think on balance, you know, there's been a huge increase in interest in biodiversity issues. There's been a big increase also on the net zero agenda. On balance, do you think that this is all pointing in the right direction? And do you feel, would you say you're more optimistic than you were, say, 5 years ago when I first met you?
I'm always optimistic because I think that the situation is becoming more and more serious, and therefore major action is becoming more and more imperative. And we are seeing more and more companies and governments making very significant commitments. We're seeing the finance sector start to really pay attention to this in a big way. And we're seeing innovations there that will help a lot in terms of channeling capital in directions that will help incentivize better behavior and so on. So I'm optimistic that we will address these challenges on climate and on biodiversity. What I am very concerned about is how painful the process of getting from here to there is going to be. And progress needs to accelerate. This year is a huge year for biodiversity, right? So we've got the Convention on Biodiversity having its big meeting. The Chinese are hosting it. There's talk of something like a Paris moment for biodiversity. I hope that we see that. And that's really elevating interest in that issue. It's a complex issue. It's hard for policymakers to understand, but incredibly important. Maybe if we look at the basic science and ecology of the planet, may be more important even than climate change, right? As you start to dismantle these ecosystems, remove species from them through extinctions and pollution effects and forest fragmentation and so on, the ecology of these systems starts to unravel. They become less resilient. You start to get positive feedbacks, which are very damaging for other biodiversity, for the climate and so on. And they interact. The biodiversity and the climate situations are very interconnected. So a lot more work is needed on this. We're seeing a lot more attention, and I hope that that's going to accelerate.
Sadly, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Nigel. It was, as always, really interesting and valuable to speak to you. Look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you very much, Holly. Great to talk with you. Bye-bye.